We were there on a demolition operation, taking out some big infrastructure for Hamas. And at the end of a long day of battles and skirmishes in there, and really at the finish line where they had everything wired up and we're on our way out, kind of within 30 minutes of being out of there after like an 8-hour insertion with the tanks and a major operation. So we're right there controlling a part of the neighborhood where the guys, they didn't infiltrate there. And the whole street just blew up, next to us, the whole street, which we knew was not part of the plan yet. And instantly we knew this was a disaster, and an entire platoon and in our company was buried in the rubble among other guys that ended up dying in the battle that day. So that was long. It was the most IDF losses in one day in the 2 years of war.
Today, we're joined by David Matlin, senior news anchor at I-24 News, lecturer at Reichman University, longtime journalist covering Israeli security and diplomacy, and an IDF reservist with more than 2 decades of frontline experience. At the same time, the region is entering a new phase, with Israel engaged in escalating confrontations with Hezbollah and Iran, raising questions about whether the Middle East is on the brink of a much larger war. David, welcome to our show.
It's an honor to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Israel, as we know, is now in a direct confrontation with Iran in ways we haven't seen before. Do you think we're witnessing the beginning of the most consequential Middle East war in decades?
Yeah, actually, you're hitting me right up my alley in terms of the way I've been looking at this in no small terms. And I'm not only kind of an optimist about the situation as it's developed, but I think we're highly underrating the moment we're in. I think at large, the discussion around what's being accomplished, what's being done, what's at stake. I do think it's, despite all the attention, there's an underrated character to what's happening here today in this standoff, and the way that Israel in the last 2+ years has been able to turn the tide, turn the table. I mean, we were really in a corner against this Iranian axis just over 2 years ago. Israel was the heavily deterred party. I mean, truly, they had established a strategy that could have destroyed the state of Israel, but in the 2 years since of sort of fighting back, being pushed into a must-act situation as a small country here. It's a remarkable standoff and achievement for Israel, and I do believe actually underrated in terms of what's being accomplished.
Now, speak about how central Iran is to everything Israel faces today. You have Hamas in Gaza, obviously, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria and Iraq. You have the Houthis in Yemen. The real conflict isn't with all these militias. It's actually was always with Iran. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, Iran has the regime in Iran through the IRGC in the last 20 years, especially, has become truly the provider, a spiritual overlord. That's and a guy putting their experts on the ground in all these places you mentioned as well to train and equip all these units. So Iran has been, it wasn't the birthplace of this ideology, but it's been the great purveyor of it in line with its revolutionary, contract to export the revolution and come get Israel, in terms of Israel being the metaphysical Satan, essentially, form of Satan on the earth in terms of the way they've defined it. And America, of course, in their terminology. This has truly been, yeah, I mean, in no small terms, this has been a major fight that they've decided to ratchet up against us.
Now, Iran built this ring of fire, and ultimately, October 7th was the big escalation of this ring of fire with Hamas in Gaza. Do you think that Iran miscalculated Israel's response to October 7th?
That's a good question. Whether the miscalculation, I think there have been a series of miscalculations from Iran, but whether October 7th really is in their lap, a lot of the analysis that's come out really has seen that they weren't ready for the great showdown yet. They thought that they needed some more time. In fact, they wanted to be nuclear, or at least really more on the threshold before this showdown, and that Hamas may have jumped the gun, that, Sinwar may have gotten ahead of them a bit in their planning, and in other words, led them down this trap of destruction, one sort of bad miscalculation after another. At the same time, look, I mean, you can look at someone like Hassan Nasrallah, the former leader of Hezbollah, who was a great orator on the subject. Okay, very vocal for 2 decades plus, 3 decades, really explaining and giving these incredible speeches. He was arguably more influential and carried more clout, in the streets of across the Middle East at times, being even more vocal at times than the Ayatollah, both of them, though, in the same vein, describing us as the spider web that would crumble when you touch a part of it, that despite having the biggest army in the region, that we were the fragile society. It looks now, yes, those were all great miscalculations on the parts of the Ayatollah, on the parts of the leaders of these proxies surrounding us. They underestimated Israel. I don't think they miscalculated in terms, again, I go back to the strategy that they were building. This axis of regional networks and proxies was effective. I mean, they had the hardware to probably destroy the state of Israel in place. Just 2 years ago, they really had established something that, especially with the nuclear umbrella from Iran, could have been the destruction of us here. But they did. They miscalculated horribly, as it turns out, in terms of that they could just keep pushing and pushing us. I think Iran in particular, if you want to take it back to October 7th, I think that was more of a Hamas miscalculation that then led to another series of miscalculations, by Hezbollah and by Iran. But I think Hamas kind of started them off on a bad foot, in other words.
And I want to ask you on the other flip side, do you think Israel was discovered a strength that they didn't know that they had? Meaning, before October 7th, if you would have asked anybody in Israel, you're going to take on all these different proxies, and then you're going to take on the head of the snake, do you think anybody would confidently say that that was possible?
Look, I mean, it's like a staggering, that question moves me, someone who's been here and immersed myself in the security apparatus here since I made Aliyah myself just over 20 years ago, try to put myself at the front of Israel's front lines, literally speaking. But I mean, at the front of our issues when it comes to, facing with the country's biggest dilemmas and biggest issues. So, I saw the buildup of that. I recall in my regular army service, in their second intifada even, and facing the second Lebanon war, and those times were looking at these threats as they were growing, as they were just becoming greater and greater, and already feeling 20 years ago at that stage that somehow the ball was in their court, that we were playing defense, we were playing responsive to the situation. They kept growing and getting stronger. And of course, our walls got taller and our underground barriers got deeper and our wonder weapons got more sophisticated. Our defensive systems got more sophisticated, but they adapted, more and more. And it felt clearly by, the 20 teens and up to 2023. I mean, we were heavily deterred. If I face it myself, there was, of course, a huge sort of doubt and uncertainty of how we would ever dismantle or take on this massive network. Hezbollah in particular, with their massive arsenal, 150 to 200,000 missiles pointed at us, more missiles than all of Europe combined. You had over 50,000 in Gaza. I'm talking pre-October 7th, all this, all pointed at us and, had already been used. I mean, this was not an empty threat. We understood what Gaza potentially could do. Hezbollah was this looming monster in Lebanon over the state of Israel. And then, of course, Iran building up all the time, and there are other proxies you mentioned. There was a huge doubt. I mean, almost disastrous doubt in what we really could achieve. I mean, our last foray deep into Lebanon in 2006 proved inconclusive, in terms of really did we knock them back or not. Of course, we did a lot of damage to them, but the country was filled with uncertainty. And I can just tell you, after the evisceration on October 7th, it was a true moment of a true gut check, a true test for everybody here in terms of are we going to crumble or are we going to rally ourselves to this challenge once and for all? Especially, I can tell you, as somebody who then mobilized with my reserve unit in the beginning of the war there, seeing all these young, the mass of the fighting people today in their 20s, this is their first big test. This was their war. And they're a generation that's locked in online, very social media, very worldly, tuned in to what's going on around the world and what people say about us and think about us. And this is the generation that really rose to the challenge. These young 20-somethings in Israel that proved, at large that they were committed, that they believed in what we're doing here, and they were able to commit themselves for the greater part of 2 years to go and actually fight it. So there was a massive doubt hanging over us on October 7th. I recall mobilizing, trying to retake control over Israeli territory just in the first weeks after October 7th. I mean, that was really all we were up to as an army in those first 2 weeks was just trying to regain what we could consider full control over Israeli territory, the Gaza periphery, while the looming thing going on in the north. I mean, this is unbelievable doubts hanging over us. And then looking in at the blackened out Gaza Strip, because at the time power had been cut. We'd had these positions like in sandbag kitchen windows of kibbutz houses, like on the edge, looking at the Gaza Strip. Well before an offensive or anything, we didn't know how we were going to go tackle what was in there, but the place is pitched out black. And still the sound of Muslim prayer, with they're hooked up to their generators, whatever, coming out on routine out of the blackness in there. And of course, the drones and the rockets and different attacks, and just what a scary monster that was that we did not know. And I'll be honest with you, in our heart of hearts, if we were going to be able to tackle or not, just looking into Gaza, much less the rest of everything else we've done at this point. So yeah, those doubts, it's my long-winded way of trying to say those doubts were enormous. There was no certainty over what we were able to do until we set out to do it. And in this moment now, it's still staggering and underrated in terms of what challenge we really rose to and overcame. Absolutely.
Mhm. So do you think in a sense there was some sort of silver lining to, October 7th?
That's now the glaring reality. And I do come around to that I don't, we needed to do this, in my opinion. We needed to rise to this fight and challenge, because it was going to come get us one way or another. There was, it's hard to even fantasize about a diplomatic out for Israel when it comes to the likes of the Iranian axis and the regime in Tehran. Like, there's no diplomatic off ramp for that. Again, they made this essentially the religion to stamp us out of the region. You can't. There's no diplomatic outcome. There's no diplomatic resolution to that issue with them. The fight was going to come to us one way or another, the sooner or later. And we were trying to stave that off as much as we could. I know a lot of the world doesn't perceive us that way, but that's, in all the different ways we were trying to stave off that fight. So yeah, it was coming for us, and it needed to be fought sooner than later, because of the way that they were force building and multiplying. That was going to be just a staggeringly worse conflict for us the more time that went by. It appears that it really did take something as awful as October 7th to light that fire, to force us to action. And there is, call it a silver lining, an upside. We saved ourselves out of that disaster. It took that disaster to get us to take action and change the whole security doctrine now, because now the state of Israel is adopting a new doctrine. No more weapons and defensive weapons and walls. We can't allow, an entity that's parading and chanting our destruction to possess the means to do so, even if they're behind a big wall, or even if they're, 500 kilometers away in the Middle East. That was something we allowed, in all these different areas. We said, all right, as long as we can contain them, we can talk them out of things, we can build our walls bigger. The doctrine has changed now. We're like, no one is allowed in the region. Luckily, we have the ability to extend our power into the region, but we're not allowing enemy groups or people who are chanting our destruction to build up the means to do so, no matter where they are. And that's a new doctrine that's emerged out of the ashes of this October 7th. And so, yeah, in a way, there has been a major upside. We've saved ourselves based on being forced to do so in the worst way.
So now, what would the collapse or the weakening of Iran's regional influence mean for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas?
It's a fantastic isolation. This has been one of the great patrons, the best patron they've had. Certainly Hezbollah. Okay, Hamas has played crafty games in the Middle East for decades, with and without Shiite Iranian support. They enjoyed a lot of it recently, so that's been a huge thing. Hezbollah is really a direct offshoot, and they are critically tied to Tehran, the Houthis as well. It is. You look at just the isolation now, even with some form of a regime still standing in Iran, it's questionable what that even is at this point. But you see already the isolation of Hezbollah here, where it's not the same Syria anymore. You've got the Syrian forces now from Damascus lined up along the border, already getting into skirmishes. That is a huge, what used to be their highway. Hezbollah owned Syria for the better part of the last decade, controlled that. They were the power in the region. And before that, obviously with Assad and everything else, but they were, the power brokers. So that's a major loss for them to now be cut off from that whole corridor. The government in Beirut is doing everything, I guess, and they can to sort of distance themselves, and they're issuing tough tough words and all that. In other words, they're getting no support in Beirut. We're putting enormous, enormous pressure on them. The United States is right there in that picture as well. So yeah, they're more isolated than they've ever been, and that definitely drives up the spigot. I mean, just intelligence reports say that in the last year, in 2025, Iran managed to smuggle over $1 billion, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Still, post just in the last year. So of course, it's a major, major hit. And it does seem like the best way, the best prospect we've ever had to actually getting rid of these organizations.
Mhm. Now, it seemed after the beeper attack and after the leaders of Hezbollah were killed, that Hezbollah was on its way out. But we still see them firing rockets and things like that. Is it surprising to you that they're still kicking, they're still alive?
Yes and no. It's been eye-opening to some degree to see the reality a little bit. Okay, what they still have, what they could do. One of the things that struck me most was when they managed to kill 2 soldiers right at the border, almost 2 weeks ago now, but a tank that had gotten disabled right on the other side of the border. They were towing it back, and they shot at the big bulldozer thing that the D9 that was towing the tank, killing 2 soldiers. And to me, that struck me like, wow, they can strike that close to the border again. It was really a shakeup for me. It took me back 20 years to sort of 2006 mode of Hezbollah, which was much smaller, first of all, to say than what we have seen just in these last few years. So there maybe, we've definitely degraded them. I mean, we heavily, heavily degraded them. We've seen over and over, and not just taking out Nasrallah is probably the most important thing. Again, he was the figurehead, the entire region, really bowed down to or cowered to. And as in most cases in the Sunni world, he was, not a revered figure, but still a powerful figure. So taking out the leader, we know we have destroyed a huge portion of what was their arsenal. Our intelligence infiltration was enormous there. All the things that have happened in our fighting. So they are enormously degraded. Look, they're a guerrilla organization in their roots, based in the population up there. These aren't foreign usurpers or anything like that. They are the Lebanese people of southern Lebanon. Not everyone, but obviously they're a homegrown organization. So it's not, I don't think the expectation was ever that they were going to be suddenly gone. In Israel, it's more about reducing their ability to harm us or eliminating it. And so that has been drastically reduced. Yes, these are low bar activities that they're engaged in right now. These small rockets that they're firing into the north, the drones that are by design, things that are easy to conceal and launch in relatively small numbers. Look, our defenses are pretty tight up there. The army is deployed along the border in a way that, and some reports say even inside southern Lebanon at this point, in a way that they haven't been, so, or at least in a while. So, no, I don't. It's nothing to be dismayed by. This is a resilient, tough, and committed organization, Hezbollah. Okay, they're committed to our destruction. They're as good as anybody. And for a while, they were really one of the most potent military forces in the entire planet. And it was all facing us. So they are heavily degraded. We're degrading them by the hour. Look, nothing shocking about it. These are things that will take time. But again, that isolation that now surrounds them as we're pursuing them and chasing them away from our border, those are the new elements that we didn't have before. So I think there's a lot of room to be encouraged.
Yeah, they say about their missile arsenal is greater than many European countries combined.
It was. It was. It was. It was bigger than all of Europe combined. Before October 7th, they had a missile arsenal larger than all the European countries combined. Shocking, but and all aimed at us. All aimed at us, or at least mostly. Maybe some at Cyprus. Yeah.
Now, talk about the pager explosion operation. How historic was that? Did that surprise you in any way? And does the Mossad ever surprise you?
I mean, I think this surprised everyone. How can you not be surprised? This is the really crazy part is, look, most of what they're up to today, most of what they've been doing in Lebanon still and are doing today, right this minute in Iran, we don't know. We don't know. It still hasn't made the public. It may not. Most of what they've done, it probably won't become public for some years to come still. The pager thing was maybe just too sensational to even conceal. And that was fine. That wasn't the point of it, was to conceal it. But of course, I mean, spectacular. It's hard to overstate this stuff. I think everything that's happening right now, this is one of the great assets that Israel has brought to the table for the United States in this moment. I mean, we are a tiny country with a very potent military punch, but it's the intelligence infiltration. Okay. It's the intelligence assets that we've developed in Lebanon and Iran. I mean, this was the top shelf. This was the top priority for the Israeli intelligence apparatus, the Mossad. And it's showing, even in its little ways that it's allowed to get out there, it shows. And I think the pager operation is literally just an example, probably much deeper and an unbelievable type of infiltration moves. Similar also, I mean, to taking out the Ayatollah Khomeini on the first minutes of the war. These are incredible intelligence coups that speak to deep infiltration of their system. Yeah, it's hard to overstate how sensational that is, but also just the glimpse that it gives us of what we're capable of and the types of things we're doing right now that we don't need to be revealed, and the enemy doesn't want to be revealed. There's more happening, but yeah, incredible example. Yeah.
Now, you actually served inside Gaza during this war. What is the biggest thing the world simply does not understand about what Israeli soldiers have to deal with over there?
Well, to start out, no, this is a total misconception. I mean, it's understandable, you know. And early in the war, I kind of started to tune out of news coverage. I mean, I'm a news guy. I worked in the news for 15 years here in Israel. As a news anchor in Israel, I honestly, and it sounds over the top, but I mean, I come home from my time in the studio and turn on all the international channels, and I'm watching what they're saying, and I'm studying how they're talking about it, and I'm really, I was sort of tried to be an expert in my craft and in my field and in my where my voice fits in the range of talking about our topics. Yeah, it'd be understandable to think that Israel's the aggressor and these forlorn people in Gaza are just being trampled by some giant mechanized army, because those are the only images you get, where like Israeli tanks and then like people walking through rubble or tents in Gaza was kind of the only images appearing on an international screen or social media feed when it came to this conflict. After October 7th, of course, all these months afterwards during that actual war. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to like find any international newsreel or social media feed that showed somebody armed in Gaza, during this time. So like it became clear to me why, this picture of what's happening here is being misconstrued abroad. But I mean, to be up close in the conflict and to see how, I mean, first of all, I already knew this, being part of the IDF fighting force. I mean, it's a very I'll try to describe things in an accurate way without, sounding boastful. But I mean, to talk about the types of people, I'm honored to be among the guys who serve in the men and women, who serve in the, IDF combat reserves. It's a small percentage of the country, under 15% of the country that are actively engaged in the combat reserves. And I mean, it's a real cut of the upper sort of types of people in society. And I don't mean means or social status. I mean like the people that are sort of weeded out through all the trials and tribulations and training, and like you really get to the best of the best from around the country that are committed at this ideological level, that are able to do it both physically and mentally. There's no room for misfits. I mean, there's just absolutely, if a guy doesn't like get on with everybody else in the unit, like he's tossed, he's gone. If he's not fitting in, there's no room for somebody who's, mixing up the social order or stepping out of line and doing things that are reckless or dangerous or crazy. There's just absolutely no room for that in the IDF infantry. It's a group of people who are, responsible team players, family men, just really honestly good people, and heavily debate everything we do and that kind of thing. So you have this army full of like citizen volunteers who are the cut above the cut, um, who are stepping into this arena of Gaza, not vengeful and bloodthirsty by any means, but calculated. Like, in order to survive here, we have to go in there and now eliminate this threat, which we thought we could wall off. I was part of the 2014 war in Gaza, where another really good perspective on like what was happening in Gaza, what we were dealing with, what kind of monster we were facing there with these jihadists. Um, building themselves up in this unbelievable way to take us on. It was, the misperception there that we're just rolling in and trampling and shooting everybody and reckless and, genocide being thrown at us. All these things were so far from the reality of how we were operating and what we were dealing with in there. Okay. We weren't harassing population centers. The evacuation warnings and notices and giant leaflet drops and all sorts of incredible cyber intel ways, calling people, the efforts that were made in front of my eyes, to avoid harming people that didn't want to encounter us when we say, hey, we're coming into this neighborhood to operate. And we did this very piece by piece too. There was always, in my offense, I was in the Gaza Strip for about a year total during the war. The first 6 months of the war, we were mobilized in the central Gaza Strip. And then I was another 6-week chapter in the middle, and then came back, as it turned out, from July until November of this last year. So I was in for like kind of the end of the war too. In fact, it was my unit who was in the field in the central strip areas, Deir al-Balach and all that. It was our zone where we received the live hostages back at the end. I was one of like maybe 80 guys from the IDF. I thought it would be a bigger deal. Like I was expecting like, oh, the whole army to be there that day. Lots of, no, it was like a couple vans from the Central Command and about 80 so of us from the battalion securing the zone, and these guys were handed back. And that was, so I saw a lot of phases of the war as well. And I just think that the misperception has been always that we're a brutal fighting force, when really we're calculated and careful, and encountering heavily armed resistance from heavily fortified tunnel bunkers everywhere you can't even believe, right on the other side of the border. I mean, up until 2 years later, we're still discovering literal bunkers just on the other side of the border, places we've been operating and walking for 2 years already, still haven't found them. So it was an incredibly developed enemy, incredibly well trained and armed enemy, and one that had baited us in the worst way. So those are I think the misperception that we were just sort of chasing around a forlorn civilian population is just not at all the nature of what we were up to there.
So now you mentioned you went into Gaza in 2014 and you went in just now. Did you see any differences between the two times that you went in?
Yeah, really different experiences. And so different. I mean, obviously in 2014, it was a relatively short war for the ground forces. We spent just about 2.5 weeks. The ground operation, my battalion, was mobilized for about 2.5 weeks. The whole ground forces operation was less than a month. We were involved for about 2.5 weeks of it, right at the beginning of the ground phase. And we were, after about 4 or 5 days of training and gearing up, we were sent into the northern part of the strip, very northern part, by Erez and Beit Lahia and these kind of areas, right in the northern strip. Again, they were heavily, they were set up. I mean, the whole thing, they were so impressively set up and waiting for us. It was the kind of thing, it was like you walked into it was so intensive. Even after this whole year of, fighting throughout Gaza during this war, the combat and resistance and organized sort of, encounters that it faced at that time in 2014 were more intense. Were somehow like just pound for pound, minute by minute, more intense. They were so ready for us, and I think we came in a much lighter way. They knew that we didn't have the heart or the political will or the real societal push at that point to go all the way, clear them out, and that was in a way it made it harder for us, the fighting guys. No one wants to die in that war. No one wants to die anyway, but I mean, no one wants to die in that conflict that they know isn't actually really going to solve the problem. It's like another, the term mow the grass, these ugly terms for kind of, knocking back the enemy, but not really getting rid of them. I think in our heart of hearts, we didn't know. Obviously, hour to hour, we're wondering if we're going to get that order to go all the way and go into Gaza City and all that. But the forces that were, mobilized, it was clear to kind of everyone the political will. We didn't want to do that as a country or as a government or whatever at that time. There was no true motivation to go in there and, finish the job and get rid of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad from power in there. So that was a hard conflict to go into when it was so dangerous and intense. And you just in your gut felt like it wasn't going to be the solution. That's a hard thing to get into. So there was something more traumatizing and heavy to us. We've discussed this a lot. Me and the guys sort of sitting around the campfire. We had a lot of time. A good portion of the guys who are still with me now were with me those 12 years ago now. There's a good batch of us that were there too. So we have a lot sort of experience to chew on. That was a tough war in that regard. That was really intensive. It was just we didn't know what we were really. We did accomplish things. Obviously, we went in there. We tackled Hamas cells. We took out tons of launchers. We found cross-border tunnels. We accomplished what we were set out to do, in those 300 to 1 kilometer, 300 meter to about a kilometer range over the border. We were successful. Still, we had left them in there, and that was the sort of bad feeling coming out of that conflict, where there was something different in this war. That feeling is, you touch on, of like the silver lining aspect of like, we were compelled this time to say, this is not another lawn mowing operation. I don't like using that term, but I mean, I think that's a common term for kind of what we were up to in those years of like pushing them back, knocking them back. We knew this was different, and we were more motivated because of that, because we felt we were truly out to kind of solve that situation finally. unfortunately, in those circumstances. But there was a greater motivation, less of that sort of sick gut, like, you know, I don't want to die for this kind of feeling. Like, no, like we were ready to do what we had to do to save our country in that moment. There was a greater sense of that. In a way, it was less heavy. Obviously, the insane heaviness of the whole country and uncertainty surrounding all of us in those moments was unbelievable. But there was a different sort of feel that pushed us forward in this war than 2014 was really tough one and intense one. Yeah.
Now, how difficult is it to fight an enemy that operates from tunnels and inside civilian areas? They don't wear a uniform. You've spoken to other IDF soldiers. They said like, you don't know who's going to shoot at you. It could be a child. It could be an old lady. It could be an old man. I mean, anybody could shoot at you. Um, Maybe speak about how difficult that is.
I mean, probably the most difficult circumstance that, you know, a democratic, law abiding citizen volunteer army can embark on. I mean, there are ways to just, take away that advantage, so to say, if you fight in a, form of other, with the methods of others, say the Russians or whatever. We could have just, carpet firebomb the whole place, and who cares who's wearing what clothes and what tunnels they're hiding in. We had the power to actually not fall into that trap and just play the world like the rest of the world plays militarily. Because I don't know, every other war, conflict you see around the world, one side has the kind of power, they're going to use it. Again, we're in a way, we're the nice guys of the Middle East. We don't act that way, despite all the perceptions of us as, bomb thirsty, this and that. Like, that's not how we play. So we did have to face and deal with those traps because we don't want to hurt people that we don't need to hurt, going into this, even after the, just defacement of October 7th, learning this sense, with the worst atrocities in the kibbutzim around Gaza being committed by these sort of so-called second and third waves of Gazans coming in who were just your average citizen people, unarmed, quote unquote civilians. I mean, we found, sorry to be graphic, but I mean, clearly dead Gazan civilians, in the kibbutz, on October 7th, they've been killed by army and security forces, but they were in there. Nobody brought them in. They were coming in to do harm. Okay. So, it's hard to, on one side, it's hard to say, well, they're good and they're bad. I mean, look at what they did on October 7th. We couldn't differentiate in that moment either, who was a danger and who wasn't. Men and women of all stripes were coming across the border and committing atrocities and kidnapping and everything else. So, that's the underlying reality of the enemy you're facing. At the same time, we're still trying to abide by our humanity, and we're not acting like them in these conflicts. And it is crazy to see when they set up these little ceremonies and checkpoints and things that Hamas did. Suddenly they have all these shiny uniforms. You're right, as you've heard. I mean, we never encountered a combatant wearing a uniform in my 2 years, throughout our 2 years of fighting inside Gaza. We've encountered a lot of combatants, a lot of our guys, never one wearing a uniform. Okay. It's the jeans and t-shirt party, that's coming. And that's by design. You're right. To make things more complicated for us, to simply make it harder for us to find them and get them. And they are. I mean, according to all the assessments, I remember Wall Street Journal articles, right on the eve of our sort of incursions into Gaza, talking about this being the most impregnable fort ever created, the Gaza Strip, the most difficult combat conditions ever conceived. Very well might be. Again, to not boast, but I mean, it is quite possible that what we set out and accomplished in there, tackling this stuff, has been one of the most, if not the most successful urban warfare campaign of all time by a democratic, law-abiding citizens army that chose to go street to street and, uproot the problem in its minutia as we could, versus as much as it's, again, false perception that we just leveled the whole place. That is not ever what we did in Gaza. So we did work methodically. We did work to go after their tunnel complex. And much of what I did in there was counter tunnel warfare and dealing with a civilian clothed combatant force in there full of anti-tank missiles and a drone air force and snipers and machine gun positions and tunnels going under our feet and popping up behind us and everywhere. That's what we had to take on. But the IDF, we did develop successful techniques to slowly, go in there and get them out and win. Essentially, what I found throughout all my time there was no objective that we couldn't accomplish. There was no fortified area or neighborhood or tunnel complex that ultimately proved to be too complicated for us to get in and defeat them in. So that was a huge thing. It became clear, certainly by the offensives of August, September of 2025 here, I think it was heavily underrated. Again, how successful the IDF campaign had become on the ground, our techniques, where we had shown them that they couldn't keep us out of anywhere, that we were going to be able to get in anywhere, we were going to be able to deal with the civilian population that they try to keep in our way. And we had proved successful. That I think they knew they couldn't hide. They were not going to be able to hide from us. And it was a big, big factor that I think was underrated and what led them to a deal. Obviously, the diplomatic factors, the right people in charge to making it happen. It was the IDF pressure. It was that unpopular offensive that even in Israel was being decried as, there was the refuse orders movement and things like that at the time. Even in Israel, huge doubt cast upon that offensive that we were a part of. From up close, I'll tell you, I never had doubt about that. I knew this was the way. We had to show them that either if they were going to deal or we were going to come and get them. There was nowhere they could hold us back from anymore, despite how complex the traps were. And again, not by brutal force, but just special techniques and tactics and ways that we were able to go in there and just uproot them.
What are the actual rules that IDF soldiers receive about avoiding civilian casualties, and how difficult is it to keep by those? By those.
There's always a factor. Look, I spent a lot of my time in the West Bank, serving around the West Bank, where that's a huge, huge deal. The rules of engagement, the open fire protocols, very strict, especially in a place like the West Bank, which is, look, any IDF combat soldier in the last 20 years has done a lot of time in those very complicated areas where you're basically a hybrid police force, keeping order in between these restive populations. And of course, in the face primarily of a massively hostile, Palestinian community that's plotting to find every hole in your defenses, so that's complicated. In Gaza, same thing. In a way, look, it was less complicated in a certain level, but still, no matter how hot that combat zone was, how much advance warning had been given to a neighborhood, people to evacuate, and, how much we're being shot at from there. You could paint your most hostile place you could think of in Gaza. There were still, orders in place, rules in place for like how and when we open fire. Okay. And certainly when you come to like aiming at a person, and pulling the trigger, lots of rules around that. Yeah. We're still even facing combatants. When somebody's disarmed or not considered, we're not out to, kill everyone at all. There are rules for even once someone's been quote unquote neutralized, they've dropped their gun or they're shot in the leg. Those are situations where like you're not supposed to fire at that person anymore. But the caution also for, an unknown, you see somebody in the field, definitely it was never a shoot first, ask questions later scenario with the IDF. There are always rules in place for the steps you take, in the field, for the things you're supposed to do that lead up to, having the sort of, all right, you've reached the phase of, step 1, 2, 3, of what do I do in this scenario? You've reached the phase of, all right, open fire. Those types of things are always in place. So that's a big part of the IDF, that responsibility of having a gun in your hand and having that ultimate, sort of power of life and death. I mean, that's a big, big deal in the IDF fighting corps, in all levels. It's from the second you get a rifle in basic training, that's, ingrained in you as this sort of this heavy responsibility, the burden of being an legally armed, person by the state. There's a real, you know, these situations, as complicated as they are, and like these combat zones, and you having to make these decisions. Again, I come back to, you're not thrown into that. This is a position you've worked hard to get to. That the Army has trained you and sort of weeded you out from others in order to be the right person to go into those situations. It's basically, there's been a massive profiling to get you into that position. You're not there in this really sticky situation without having the Army and essentially the state already define you as being one of the people who are cut out to be in that situation. Okay, there's a lot of training and a lot of experience, and the most difficult things are like, the most seasoned and experienced guys get chosen to do them too, even within the Army ranks. That's a very big consideration. So again, as difficult as those scenarios are, yes, there's a lot of caution involved, and you have people in those situations as much as possible who are trained and able to, handle it. That's the idea. So it's complicated, but yes, there's an effort made, of course, all the time, not to open fire when it's not necessary, for sure.
Why do you think those realities rarely appear in the international media coverage? Is there any way that Israel could come out on top in the PR war, or is it kind of stacked against them?
It's a tough one. I mean, that's the dilemma of our time in some way, or has been for a while, but of course, acutely today. I kind of feel both sides of that. I do think that there's two sides to the way I think about it. In other words, I do think there could be a more professional, concerted, organized, top-down effort, by Israel. Even just seeing the way things are explained in the war right now as we're sort of fighting shoulder to shoulder with the United States is really interesting to see how the Pentagon, essentially in the same war, how the Pentagon messages things versus how Israel messages things. We get this, clear sort of, all right, it seems we could do a better job, having an organized government response system that works together with the army, putting out better content. So yes, we could be doing a better job on the other side of this. I don't actually think it would matter. And I almost think it's a misdirection of our efforts. In a way, I think we should be trying a little harder, but we shouldn't be telling ourselves that we're losing this sort of PR struggle, be like it's our fault. I don't think that's actually the case. You have massive forces around the world, huge populations and media bases and academic circles. And I mean, we are a very small fish in the pond. Okay. Even all our supporters, and if all of our people and all our supporters, I mean, we're dwarfed, by the masses, to say it that way, around the world. And in many cases, the organized effort to, look, I learned this. I was an advocate for a few years. I worked with APAC in the US here. In 2016 to 19, I sort of took a foray and, in a way, an ambassadorial role. I'd been living in Israel for a while. I wanted to really immerse myself in that sort of American Israel connection space at the highest level with, the politicians and that. So I took on a senior directorship with APAC in Northern California for a few years. And, I learned, the effort it takes to instill, to provide that pro-Israel and, reality-based message. We're there talking to the congressman. There's, 6, 7, 8 other organizations who are lined up right behind us to talk to him with an opposite message. Anti-effort is there, and it's bigger than ours, and it's got more people than ours, and they have major backing. We're probably never going to beat that. So on one side, yes, we should do a better, I think, more professional outreach, but we should realize that we're probably not going to win it anyway. Not that we shouldn't try, but that, in other words, our focus should be just not on combating everything everybody says. I think it's a losing fight there to try to argue every horrible point, or to think that anti-Semitism is something that, we can educate people out of or whatever. We need to focus on ourselves. I think our best results as a people have come when we focus internally and just, we know who we are. We look ourselves in the mirror. I say this all the time. After 20 some years in the combat forces here in the IDF, I've done everything, like all the ugliest things, quote unquote, that we've had to do, from, West Bank home arrests to, all the settlement stuff, going into Gaza, all the things, the worst stuff the country's had to deal with. I've been so upfront for all of that for 20 plus years. I can look myself in the mirror completely. I have no sort of moral nightmares about what I've been up to. No, my humanity is intact, and this country's humanity is intact. And, we are doing things the best we can in the face of enemies who are really trying to make that complicated for us and drag us through the mud. So I think we just have to keep the focus on doing the right thing, because our real friends out there, take the Pentagon, for example, some important friends at the Pentagon, they know what's going on. Okay. They see reality. This is an organization that cuts through the nonsense, the noise in media. So we're good friends with them, for example, because we are doing things right and above board and with moral character and conviction. And we have to continue to be ourselves. Most importantly, the PR war isn't what will, determine us. Focus on ourselves, be the right thing, do the right thing. And, our friends that matter will be there as long as we maintain that. So that's my take on sort of the PR war. We can do better. Ultimately, we're probably not going to win it anyway, but we focus on ourselves and just keep doing what we know is the right thing to do in all of our situations.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, there were protests in America on October 8th. Even before IDF went into Gaza, there were protests. So,
Long before.
yeah,
I mean, we hadn't done anything. We didn't know how to respond, by the time people are already out there chanting for our destruction. Yeah. Eye-opening.
yeah. And for whatever money that APAC, whatever fund, you don't compare it to Qatar, so it's like you said,
And many others. Yeah.
and any
It's not a
others.
money game. Right. I learned that too. I can dispel that right up the front. It's not a money game. We're not buying the vote or anything like that. No. Yeah, there are thresholds to be in the game, to be at the table. You got to, it's politics in America. You contribute funds to things. It's not the money that's tipping the scale on the pro-Israel issue at all. It's a drop in the bucket. It's total misconception. Again, it comes back to the real connection, the fact that there's something real, positive and going on in Israel, that you cut through the noise. The majority of people, at the congressional level. They see what's going on. They're exposed to things in a real way that goes in our favor. I mean, well, the most effective thing ever, and I'll just talk about APAC for a minute, but this translates into so many other ways. You can look at Birthright and all sorts of trips, and you probably know this many ways, Daniel. People coming to Israel and exposing themselves to the realities as much as they can is one of our great assets. The reality. We want people to get here, come see it. As APAC, look, you'd bring freshman delegations of senators and congressmen. The most effective part of their experience here in 10 days or whatever was going to Ramallah, was going to meet everybody. Well, wait out here. You go meet them, do it. Talk to everybody you want to talk to. Nothing made them, come around more than like getting real exposure to what they're saying, what's going on the ground, seeing it up close for themselves. Those things, the truth is on our side. Reality is an asset to us in this whole situation. So that's something that may sound counterintuitive to a lot of what people are reading and hearing and seeing out there. But I think that's really what we have again, is that, the reality is on our side, and exposing people as deeply and openly as we can to the issues is only helps us.
Can you talk about a little bit about what goes through your mind when you have to go back into Gaza for another deployment? You have to put on your uniform again, and that's obviously not easy psychologically. How does it feel like? If you can explain it to us.
It's amazing, but again, I went to the Army in 2004. So at this point, 22 years. And I've also had to sign some extra volunteer papers in the last years here, over the age requirement and all this, being in my early 40s. So there's been a lot of sort of test points for me of like off ramps, sort of optional, like, all right, I don't have to do this anymore. I mean, I started off as a 23-year-old volunteer. That alone was like, all right, sign the special forms. You're not compelled to put yourself into these kind of roles here. Along the way, I've had to take these kind of like, even though it was what I wanted to do, sometimes it's hard to put that pen to paper. Since the war started here in October, in October 7th, I've had to sign 2 additional volunteer forms to stay in the combat forces. And they're like, the forms they put in front of you are, they'll take a breath away a little. They don't mince their words about like the danger you're putting yourselves into, hey, you're, sorry to tell you, it's a bad role, but sign here, like they're, they don't try to sugarcoat it. It's a hard form to sign. Just as it is, the IDF reserves, as much as, there are laws in place and you're compelled to serve, nobody is out there because the law is compelling them to be there or because it's what I have to do. Like, it's people there because they believe in it. It's a volunteer force. All right. We're out there because we believe in what we're up to, because our families support us, because all the pieces are in place that sort of allow us to be there, and we want to be there and show up and serve. So that is tough. It is a tough thing to take on, with more and more pressure. I'd say over the 20 some years in the Army, it's gotten harder every time. It's just a nature of the job. It's, not harder in terms of like doing it and being out there and like, yeah, experience counts. You get better at what you're doing. The Army is a comfortable place when you're used to it, all those things. But that process of putting your life on hold or your family and growing more kids each year and that kind of thing, that just gets tougher and tougher every single time. It is a huge, huge challenge to talk to your kids, especially look, the Army became a whole different thing, starting on October 7th for the kids. Before this in the reserves, you'd serve 3 weeks a year, a month a year, kind of spread into some different things. It's still a big sizable commitment, to go away for 6 months straight, the beginning of the war. And they were quite aware that people were dying out there. I mean, my battalion had the unfortunate distinction. We lost the most guys in one day in the entire war. We had 21 guys die in one day in a battle in Gaza. So the kids became aware of that stuff. I mean, my kids aren't little. My oldest is 13, and this was heavy when I told them, "Hey, I'm going back after I came home from 6 months." And a few months later, I got another call up. The look on their faces, when you just mention it. Hey, I'm gonna go back into the Army soon. Oh, it's like it is so not funny and so serious and so heavy, and like it's an extreme burden. But it's a common one. And that's it. I'm in there with guys who are almost, 80% of the guys have kids at home. I think it's actually more like 60 something, 70. It's a big percentage of guys with kids at home. Families, everybody's got something. You lean on each other. You're not alone in that burden. You're not alone with those struggles. And, you get a little snapshot too of, hanging out with, 100 guys in your company or whatever out there. Like, you see all versions of it. You start to realize one guy who's, wife's crying to him every single night on the phone. Like, you get perspective. I'm like, all right, my situation's not so bad. But it is a tough, tough, tough thing. But one that no one can be out there without the full support of their families. I had a lot of guys in my platoon that just couldn't be there because their home situation needed them, kids, wives, other things. Sometimes professional pressures. Everyone has their own issues. It's tough, no doubt. It's a major, and the burden's never been bigger than really it has. I mean, you go back to like Yom Kippur War era, to see like reservists under this kind of strain. And it's hard to compare. It's a totally different country back then, smaller place, different, so this is really an unprecedented, strain on the fighting men and women. But I mean, mostly men, going out there in the reserve units, and a small percentage of the country, a really small percentage of the country. Like at our level, the Army told us, we had like a counselor woman who came around and talked to us at the end of one of our long deployments. And she told us that people in our category, within the IDF framework, we've done the amount of days we have, the kind of service we serve. She said it's less than 1%, of people in uniform. So it's an unusual burden, that the infantry guys, the fighting men, the tank corps, these kind of guys face. Nothing simple about it. It gets harder every time, but it's such a real, you know, you're right. You can see the lights of your home, behind you when you're on the front lines. It's not an abstract thing to go do. We're not going. I also compare ourselves to the U.S. It's such a different type of service. It's tough, really tough. In the U.S. you go away for 8 to 10 months. Somewhere abroad is tough. Where it's a whole other type of character required. There's this other insane burden on the Israeli man who's 20 minutes from his home, who can never really disconnect. Who's like every day kind of still talking to the teacher and the doctor, and you maybe popping home for an hour to help walk the dog, and you come back to the war front. All the while, like there were literally times in Gaza, we're pushing an offensive into a neighborhood where a block away, a giant barrage of missiles fires up, 10, 12, 15, fire out of some underground thing right a block away from us. Oh my God, where are these going? Right as we're pushing into the area. And then someone with me, whatever, I just phone, they're going to Tel Aviv. They're on Tel Aviv. Those missiles we just shot at Tel Aviv. My kids are in the shelter. Like the missiles in front of my face. Got shot up right there. We're shot at my family in the city, hunkered in shelter. Just that connection, is so real to what you're doing and why you're fighting and why you're out there. You don't need any abstract, pump ups or, motivational. You get it, why you're there. So that helps propel you forward. That's a critical piece, the success of the IDF and what motivates us and gets us out there. And despite all the challenges,
Now, you mentioned the 21 soldiers that died on the same day. Was this the
yeah.
building collapse
It
or?
is. It is. Yeah. Yes. It is. I was in January of 2024. Right. That is known as the tragedy of the collapse. The Sona Crisa. That was. I was right there. I was right there. It was our battalion with some other special units and engineers attached. I can talk about it in brief, but I mean, I was right. I was positioned right on the edge of the street that one of their RPGs triggered, our explosives. We were there on a demolition operation, taking out some big infrastructure for Hamas. And at the end of a long day of battles and skirmishes in there, and really at the finish line, we had everything wired up, and we're on our way out, kind of within 30 minutes of being out of there after like an 8-hour insertion with the tanks and a major operation. And then suddenly, I was right there and giving cover fire because I'm in the heavy weapons platoon of our battalion, which is we bring machine guns, snipers, automatic grenade launchers, 50 cal cannons. We bring the heavy firepower for the battalion. So they bring us with every sort of battalion operation. There could be just a few hundred guys, any sort of battalion operation. They want an element of the heavy fire platoon with them. So we're right there controlling a part of the neighborhood where the guys, they didn't infiltrate there. And the whole street just blew up next to us. The whole street, which we knew was not part of the plan yet. And instantly we knew this was a disaster. And an entire platoon and in our company bit, company B was buried in the rubble, among other guys that ended up dying in the battle that day. So that was, long story short, that was that incident. An unfortunate distinction. Yeah, it was the most IDF losses in one day, in the 2 years of war.
Yeah, I remember watching that on the news, and that was pretty shocking to see. But as we end, let's end on a positive note. What gives you hope about Israel's future?
As I started out with this, I mean, I'm extremely optimistic I'm like, this is what a moment, we've achieved at this point. And it does tie back to everything you started talking to me about how October 7th proved to be the, that horrible push that we needed to do what had to be done and take the fight to our enemies who had surrounded us with the abilities to destroy us. If they had done it right, if they had done it right, this Axis could have, if they had truly been coordinated in their assault on October 7th. In that moment, if they had truly coordinated their assault from all directions with an invasion force from the north, with a slightly larger invasion force from Gaza, even with everything else in the region coming at us, I think there's a good chance. It's horrifying, but they could have destroyed us. They could have destroyed the country of Israel. If I hadn't been able to get to my base to gear up as a reservist, which that was, on the threshold of being the reality, even just on October 7th in the South, if all those elements had come to bear, they probably could have destroyed us. They had the pieces in place to actually almost unthinkable, but that was the moment we were in. So to come from that moment, living here for 20 years and everything else, I never thought we'd be fighting in a kibbutz. I mean, those are like the legends from yesteryear. I never thought that we actually see a scenario where, oh my God, we might be destroyed today, tomorrow, the next. This could be the end of it. That became something that was real for all of us here in October of 2023. So to emerge from that, the lowest point that I had experienced, and I've been here through the second Intifada in the dark, dark times of 2001 and 2. It was a horrifying time here. It didn't have the same feel of peril that this did in October of 2023, where it truly felt like the country could be, at the end here. And so to emerge from that to this position now where we have, again, you talk about the pagers, you talk about everything we've accomplished in Gaza, across the region, taking the fight to Tehran the way we have, having the United States at our side now. This is an incredible, incredible picture of victory of a people who were pushed to the corner, who rose to the challenge, who did things that we didn't know we could do. Okay, along the way, but we set out and achieved them. And I mean, look at in this moment, talk about, harkening back to Winston Churchill and never so much, been owed to so few by so many. I mean, we are in a moment like that. It's comparable to the Battle of Britain with the few hundred, Israeli, just looking at Israel, the Americans, God bless them also, part of this picture. If you're just looking at the Israel story here, a few hundred Arab men and women right now that are saving civilization, that are taking it to the Iranians on the accomplishments of everything we achieved on the ground to get to this point, to make this possible, the ground wars we fought in Gaza and Lebanon and everything up to this point. It's an incredible, incredible moment for this tiny country. I think it's brought forth a whole new Israel in terms of, yes, a country that believes in itself, capable. Look, there's a baby boom here this last 2 years. These people, expressing their ongoing commitment to this project, to this country in the strongest way, having kids and staying here and showing up. Even in our last deployment at the end of the war here, we had over 100% turnout in my reserve unit. That was like, nobody expected that. We didn't expect that looking left and right. We over 100% because everybody showed up and we had some new guys, some fresh recruits, the reserves. It was unbelievable. But all this, a picture of victory. You stroll the streets today in Tel Aviv, and it's robust and people are out living and doing their best. You wouldn't know. You'd be hard pressed to know that we're under the assaults. Our greatest enemy in the 21st century is out to harm us as much as they can, in this moment. You hardly know that, walking around the streets here. I don't mean to belittle the danger. Everybody understands it's not, but it's like, this is the picture of a country emerging victorious from this conflict. The fighting people in this country, or look at Hezbollah, despised in Lebanon. The IRGC, I'm sorry, I don't think they're a super popular group right now in Iran, with people lining up to send their kids to the next recruitment classes. Here in Israel, the fighting men and women are the heroes of the country, are beloved. People are eager to send their kid into the next ranks. Those are the signs of civilizational victory. We have emerged on top in a way here that is a testament purely to the hard work and fighting spirit and things that we've accomplished in these 2 years. So absolutely, I'm totally optimistic. Obviously, the road's not clear. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's a perilous moment, no doubt, but a lot to be optimistic about, a lot to be positive about, and truly incredible, incredible moment that we find ourselves in that we've achieved at this point. Stay tuned and stay with the Israel ride. This is going to be a really positive thing. A lot of new horizons coming our way in the next decade, no doubt.
David, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with me. I found it very inspiring, and I want to, thank you for your courage, your bravery, for standing up for our country the way you do. So I want to wish you all the best, and I hope to speak to you again one day soon.
Anytime, Daniel. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this: you can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real, it is stored safely, it is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.